put your phone or device aside and immerse yourself in this audio story. Perfect for listening on the move, while relaxing, or for bedtime listening. We release new stories daily, so make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out. This story is based on true events. The Halloween Heist. In the final hours of October 31st, 2011, something impossible happened in the supposedly transparent world of modern finance. $1.2 billion simply disappeared. Not stolen in some Hollywood-style heist. Not laundered through shell companies in distant tax havens. It vanished from customer accounts at one of Wall Street's most established firms, while regulators watched in real time. The man at the center wasn't some rogue trader operating from a basement. He was a former Goldman Sachs CEO, a United States senator, and a governor who had once been worth hundreds of millions. His name was Jon Corzine, and what he did in the shadows of MF Global would expose the darkest truth about wealth and power in America. That some people believe the rules simply don't apply to them. This is the story of how one man's arrogance, one firm's desperation, and one catastrophic bet created the 8th largest bankruptcy in American history, and left thousands of farmers, ranchers, and small investors financially destroyed. But the real mystery isn't what happened. It's what didn't happen afterward. Jon Corzine's story begins not in darkness but in light, or at least what appeared to be light. The son of an Illinois farmer, Corzine climbed the ladder of American finance with methodical precision. By 1994, he had reached the summit, CEO of Goldman Sachs, the most prestigious investment bank in the world. But even at the top, shadows gathered. In 1999, his partners at Goldman staged what insiders called a quiet coup, pushing Corzine out just before the firm's historic initial public offering. The move cost him his throne, but made him phenomenally wealthy. He walked away with hundreds of millions in stock. Most men would have retired to their estates. Corzine craved something money alone couldn't buy: legitimacy, respect, power over something larger than quarterly earnings. So he bought himself a Senate seat in New Jersey, spending a record-breaking $60 million of his own fortune to defeat a Republican incumbent. 4 years later, he became governor. But politics, it turned out, was a different kind of game than finance. Corzine's tenure as governor was marked by fiscal chaos and personal scandal, a near-fatal car crash where he wasn't wearing a seatbelt, ethical questions about his relationship with a union leader, and a state budget that hemorrhaged red ink. In 2009, New Jersey voters delivered their verdict. Defeat. For the second time in a decade, Jon Corzine had been pushed out of power. He was 62 years old, still wealthy but no longer relevant. The financial crisis had reshaped Wall Street without him. A new generation of titans had emerged. Corzine was becoming a footnote. And for men like him, irrelevance is a fate worse than bankruptcy. Which is why, in March 2010, when the board of MF Global came calling, Corzine saw not a job, but redemption. MF Global was a 200-year-old commodities brokerage with a proud history and a troubled present. The firm helped farmers hedge crop prices, ranchers manage cattle futures, small investors trade soybeans and wheat. It was profitable, but boring. Exactly the kind of stable, unsexy business that ambitious Wall Street types dismissed. Corzine didn't want stable. He wanted Goldman Sachs. He told MF Global's board he would transform their sleepy brokerage into a major investment bank, competing with the titans of Wall Street. The board, desperate for growth and star power, gave him the keys to the kingdom. They had just hired their own destroyer. From the moment Corzine took control, he began placing massive bets that would make any risk manager's blood run cold. His strategy was deceptively simple: buy European sovereign debt, bonds from countries like Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Ireland. Bonds that were trading at distressed prices because the European debt crisis was spiraling out of control. Corzine believed the bonds were undervalued, that the European Union would never allow its member states to default. He was betting that fear was overblown, and that when markets calmed, MF Global would reap enormous profits. But here's what made the bet truly insane. Corzine wasn't using MF Global's own money. He was using something called repo-to-maturity transactions, a complex accounting maneuver that allowed him to buy billions in European bonds while technically keeping them off the firm's balance sheet. It was financial engineering at its most dangerous, leverage disguised as prudence. By the summer of 2011, MF Global's exposure to European sovereign debt had swelled to $6.3 billion. To put that in perspective, the entire firm's equity, its cushion against losses, was just $1.4 billion. Corzine had bet 4.5 times the firm's net worth on a single trade. Inside MF Global's offices, risk managers began sounding alarms. They warned that the European exposure was catastrophic, that if the bonds declined in value or liquidity dried up, the firm would face a death spiral. Corzine dismissed their concerns. He had been CEO of Goldman Sachs. He had been a United States senator and governor. Who were these mid-level functionaries to question his judgment? In meetings, he would sometimes cut off objections with a simple phrase, "I know how to manage risk." It was the arrogance of a man who had never truly failed, who had always been rescued by his wealth or connections or golden parachute. That arrogance would soon cost thousands of people everything they had. But Corzine's European bet was only the visible part of the iceberg. Beneath the surface, something far darker was happening. MF Global was bleeding cash, struggling to meet its daily obligations as clients and counterparties grew nervous about the firm's stability. Under financial regulations, customer funds held by a brokerage must be completely segregated, kept in separate accounts, untouchable, sacred. These are the deposits that farmers use to hedge their wheat crops, that ranchers use to lock in cattle prices, that individual investors use to trade futures. The segregation rules exist for one reason: to ensure that if a brokerage fails, customer money is protected. In the final weeks of October 2011, as MF Global's cash crisis intensified, someone made a decision. They would use customer money to plug the holes. The mechanics were Byzantine, designed to obscure what was actually happening. Money was transferred from segregated customer accounts to MF Global's own accounts, then used to meet margin calls and fund operations. Executives would later claim these were temporary loans, that the money would be returned before anyone noticed. But the transfers kept growing. Hundreds of millions, then more than $1 billion, siphoned from accounts that belonged to farmers in Iowa, ranchers in Texas, small traders across America who had trusted MF Global to safeguard their life savings. The word for what was happening is simple: theft. But in the sanitized language of Wall Street, it was called a liquidity issue, or operational complexity. Corzine would later testify that he never intended for customer money to be used. He claimed he didn't know the details of the transfers. For a man who micromanaged billions in European debt bets, this claim was either a confession of incompetence or a masterclass in plausible deniability. On October 24, 2011, something shifted in the markets that would turn Corzine's calculated gamble into a death sentence. Moody's, one of the major credit rating agencies, announced it was reviewing MF Global for a potential downgrade. In the world of high finance, a downgrade is a vote of no confidence, a signal to counterparties that doing business with you carries elevated risk. Within hours, MF Global's trading partners began demanding more collateral, pulling credit lines, quietly distancing themselves from what they now saw as a sinking ship. The firm's stock price, already battered, went into free fall. Inside the executive offices on the 50th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, panic began to set in. Corzine and his team started desperately searching for a savior, a white knight who would buy the firm or inject emergency capital. They reached out to potential buyers, to competitors, to anyone with deep pockets. But word had already spread across Wall Street. MF Global was toxic. And then came the revelation that would make rescue impossible. On the morning of October 31st, Halloween, appropriately enough, MF Global's accountants made a horrifying discovery. They couldn't locate $900 million in customer funds. The money should have been in segregated accounts, protected and accounted for. Instead, there were holes, gaps, missing transfers, a labyrinth of movements that defied explanation. By the end of that day, the missing amount would grow to $1.6 billion. It was the largest violation of customer fund segregation rules in the history of American futures markets. Regulators were informed immediately. The Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the bankruptcy trustees, they all descended on MF Global's offices like investigators at a crime scene. What they found was chaos, incomplete records, contradictory transfers, a web of transactions so complex it would take years to fully untangle. That night, MF Global filed for bankruptcy protection. 38,000 customer accounts were frozen. Farmers who had hedged their crops couldn't access their money. Ranchers faced ruin. Small investors watched helplessly as their accounts were locked. The human cost was immediate and devastating. In rural America, far from the glass towers of Manhattan, the collapse of MF Global meant something far more visceral than a financial scandal. It meant bankruptcy, foreclosure, suicide. Farmers who had dutifully hedged their wheat and corn crops, doing exactly what agricultural experts advised, suddenly couldn't access the accounts they needed to protect themselves from price swings. Some lost their farms. Some lost everything. There were reports of ranchers in Montana who had trusted MF Global for decades, who now faced financial annihilation through no fault of their own. One farmer testified before Congress, his voice shaking with anger, describing how his frozen accounts had destroyed his family's livelihood. These weren't Wall Street speculators or hedge fund managers. They were ordinary Americans who had played by the rules and been betrayed by a system that was supposed to protect them. As the bankruptcy proceedings unfolded, a clearer picture emerged of the final days inside MF Global. Emails and recorded phone calls revealed a company in absolute chaos, with executives scrambling to find missing funds, to explain the unexplainable. One particularly chilling exchange involved an MF Global executive asking whether customer funds could be used for certain purposes. The response from a lower-level employee was unequivocal. Absolutely not. It would violate segregation rules. The funds were used anyway. Investigators eventually pieced together that in the final 72 hours before bankruptcy, MF Global had made hundreds of transfers from customer accounts, desperately trying to stay alive one more day, one more hour. It was financial triage performed by executives who knew they were breaking the law, but believed, somehow, insanely, that they would be able to fix it before anyone noticed. They gambled that they could find a buyer, that the European bonds would stabilize, that regulators would look the other way. They were wrong on every count. Jon Corzine's testimony before Congress was a masterpiece of evasion and selective amnesia. Sitting before hostile lawmakers, he repeated variations of the same phrases. I don't recall. I don't know. I never intended. When pressed about whether he had authorized the use of customer funds, Corzine said he never gave such an instruction, but he also couldn't say that it didn't happen. He claimed ignorance of the details, while simultaneously defending the firm's European debt strategy. It was a legal tightrope walk, admitting enough to seem cooperative, while avoiding any statement that could lead to criminal charges. Watching him testify, you could see the calculation behind every word. This wasn't a man consumed by guilt or remorse. This was a man protecting himself. The investigation into MF Global would eventually involve multiple federal agencies, a bankruptcy trustee, and years of legal proceedings. Slowly, painfully, most of the missing customer funds were recovered. Not all, but enough that victims received substantial portions of their money back. But the process took years, and while customers waited, Jon Corzine moved on. In 2014, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission filed a civil lawsuit against him, alleging that he failed to properly supervise employees and ensure that customer funds were protected. The lawsuit was eventually settled. Corzine paid $5 million, a fraction of his personal wealth, and accepted a ban from trading in the futures markets. He admitted no wrongdoing. No criminal charges were ever filed, not against Corzine, not against any other senior executive at MF Global. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn, where the true scandal reveals itself. Because the collapse of MF Global wasn't just about one reckless CEO or one failed firm. It was about a system designed to protect the powerful. Federal prosecutors examined the case and concluded that while MF Global's collapse was catastrophic, they couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Corzine had criminal intent. They couldn't definitively show that he knew customer funds were being misused or that he specifically authorized the transfers. The bar for criminal prosecution in complex financial cases is extraordinarily high. Prosecutors need to prove not just that something bad happened, but that executives knowingly, intentionally broke the law. Complexity becomes a shield. Ignorance becomes a defense. And the more convoluted the financial instruments, the easier it becomes to hide behind claims of, "I didn't know," or "I delegated that responsibility." The same legal structure that prosecutes street-level criminals with harsh efficiency grinds to a halt when faced with white-collar crime involving former senators and Goldman Sachs CEOs. The absence of criminal charges sent a chilling message across the financial industry. You can bet billions recklessly, oversee the disappearance of customer funds, destroy thousands of lives, and walk away with a civil fine that amounts to pocket change. Inside trading firms and investment banks, junior employees watched and learned. They learned that the rules are different at the top. They learned that connections matter more than consequences. They learned that if you're going to commit financial crimes, do it on a large enough scale, with enough complexity that prosecutors give up trying to untangle it. MF Global should have been a watershed moment, a clear signal that the 2008 financial crisis had taught regulators to hold executives personally accountable. Instead, it became another data point in the opposite direction. Proof that the system remains rigged in favor of those with power and wealth. The victims of MF Global never got their moment of justice. Many received most of their money back eventually, but that's not the same as being made whole. The farmer who lost his farm while his accounts were frozen, getting 80 cents on the dollar 3 years later, doesn't give him back what he lost. The rancher who had to sell his herd at distressed prices because he couldn't access his hedges, a partial recovery doesn't undo that damage. And beyond the financial losses, there was the psychological wound. These were people who believed in the system, who followed the rules, who trusted that segregated customer funds actually meant something. MF Global taught them that trust was misplaced. It taught them that in modern American finance, customer protection is more suggestion than law, easily violated when convenient and rarely punished. Jon Corzine tried to stage a comeback. In 2014, he quietly launched a hedge fund, betting that the Wall Street establishment would welcome him back. Some investors did. Corzine still had connections, still had the Goldman pedigree. But the fund struggled to gain traction. Too many potential investors remembered MF Global, remembered the farmers who lost everything, remembered the $1.6 billion in missing customer funds. Even in the morally flexible world of high finance, Corzine had become radioactive. His hedge fund limped along for a few years before quietly shuttering. Today, he lives in quiet wealth, occasionally spotted at charity events or democratic fundraisers, a ghost of his former prominence. He never apologized. He never admitted wrongdoing. He never faced a single day in prison. The lessons of MF Global extend far beyond one man's hubris. They reveal fundamental truths about how modern finance actually works versus how it pretends to work. The segregation of customer funds is supposed to be the most basic, sacred protection in the brokerage industry. If that can be violated with impunity, what other protections are illusory? The MF Global bankruptcy also exposed the danger of letting executives with political connections play by different rules. Corzine's history as a senator and governor didn't just give him credibility. It gave him a network of relationships with regulators, politicians, and law enforcement officials who were predisposed to view him as one of the good guys. That bias, conscious or not, influenced how aggressively the case was pursued. A low-level trader who stole a fraction of what disappeared at MF Global would have been prosecuted swiftly and harshly, but a former senator got the benefit of every doubt. The collapse also illustrated the dangers of financial complexity as camouflage. Corzine's repo-to-maturity transactions weren't just aggressive risk management. They were deliberately opaque accounting tricks designed to hide the firm's true exposure from regulators and investors. The more complex the financial engineering, the easier it becomes to obscure risk until it's too late. This is a pattern that repeats across modern financial disasters. Long-term capital management in 1998, Enron in 2001, Lehman Brothers in 2008, MF Global in 2011. Each time, executives claim that regulators and investors simply didn't understand the sophisticated strategies being employed. But sophistication is often just another word for deception. If a financial product is too complex to explain simply, it's probably too complex to regulate effectively, which is precisely why firms create them. There's a psychological dimension to the story that deserves examination: the danger of legacy-seeking behavior in powerful men who feel their time running out. Jon Corzine was 63 when he took over MF Global, past the age when most executives would be planning retirement. He had already achieved enormous success by conventional measures: CEO of Goldman Sachs, United States Senator, Governor. But he hadn't achieved the one thing he truly craved: enduring respect as a financial genius on par with Warren Buffett or Jamie Dimon. His ouster from Goldman still stung. His defeat in the governor's race had humiliated him. MF Global was supposed to be his vindication, proof that he could build something great without the Goldman platform. That desperation, that need to prove himself, made him blind to risk. It made him dismissive of subordinates who questioned his judgment. It made him willing to bet everything on a single trade, because winning big was the only outcome that mattered. This is the pattern of countless financial disasters. A powerful person, usually male, usually past his prime, making increasingly reckless bets to recapture lost glory. The regulatory response to MF Global was predictably inadequate. New rules were proposed to strengthen customer fund protections, to increase oversight of segregated accounts, to prevent similar collapses. Some were implemented, others were watered down by industry lobbying. But the core problem remained unaddressed. There is no credible threat of criminal prosecution for executives at systemically important financial firms. Civil fines are simply a cost of doing business, already factored into compensation packages and shareholder risk models. Without the threat of personal consequences, prison time, permanent bans from the industry, criminal records, Executives will continue to push boundaries, knowing that the worst-case scenario is a settlement paid by their company's insurance. This is not a failure of individual prosecutors or regulators. It's a systemic design flaw, a legal framework that treats financial crimes as civil regulatory matters rather than criminal offenses. Perhaps the most disturbing legacy of MF Global is what it revealed about customer protections in general. After the collapse, many investors started asking uncomfortable questions about their own brokerage accounts. If segregation rules could be violated at MF Global, could they be violated elsewhere? If customer funds could disappear without triggering criminal prosecutions, what deterrent exists against other firms doing the same? The honest answer is, not much. Most brokerage customers have no way of independently verifying that their funds are actually segregated, that the protections promised in account agreements are being honored. They simply trust the system. MF Global proved that trust can be catastrophically misplaced. Yet most people continue to assume their money is safe, because the alternative, accepting that the financial system operates on faith rather than law, is too unsettling to confront. There's a broader cultural lesson embedded in the MF Global story: the gradual erosion of accountability for elites in American society. Corzine wasn't just any executive. He was connected to the highest levels of government and finance. He had advised presidents, dined with central bankers, moved seamlessly between Wall Street and Washington. That access created a protective bubble, an assumption among prosecutors and regulators that surely someone with his background wouldn't intentionally commit fraud. This benefit of the doubt is never extended to ordinary criminals, to the desperate or disadvantaged. But for the Jon Corzinas of the world, it's the default setting. The burden of proof becomes nearly impossible to meet, because the very idea that such a person could be a criminal seems implausible to those in power. This double standard corrodes the social contract, breeding cynicism and anger among those who play by the rules and watch the elite break them with impunity. In the years since MF Global's collapse, the commodities and futures markets have continued functioning, mostly unchanged. New firms have filled the void left by MF Global's bankruptcy. Farmers still hedge their crops, ranchers still trade cattle futures. The machine grinds on. But among those who lost money, among those who remember, there's a permanent scar. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to fully restore. Some former MF Global customers never returned to the futures markets, too traumatized by the experience to risk it again. Others diversified across multiple brokerages, refusing to concentrate risk with any single firm. These are rational responses to an irrational system, adaptations to a world where the protections you're promised may evaporate the moment they're needed most. The story of MF Global is ultimately a story about illusions. The illusion that customer funds are protected by law, the illusion that regulators prevent catastrophic failures, the illusion that executives face consequences for destroying lives and violating trust. Jon Corzine believed in his own illusion, that his brilliance and connections made him immune to the normal rules of risk management. He was partially right. He did escape criminal prosecution, did avoid prison, did retain most of his wealth, but he couldn't escape history's judgment. MF Global will forever be his legacy, a case study in hubris and recklessness, a cautionary tale told to future generations of business students and regulators. That's not nothing, but it's also not justice. The darkness at the heart of this story isn't just one man's greed or one firm's failure. It's the systemic indifference to the suffering of ordinary people when they're crushed by the machinery of high finance. The farmers who testified before Congress, their voices thick with desperation, didn't want complex new regulations or theoretical reforms. They wanted someone to be held accountable. They wanted to see Jon Corzine face a judge and jury, to hear him explain under oath how $1.6 billion simply vanished. They wanted what every victim of crime wants: acknowledgement, responsibility, consequences. They got none of those things. Instead, they got settlements and restructured accounts and the cold comfort of partial recovery. And they learned the lesson that victims of financial crime always learn. The system protects itself first, and everyone else never. On Halloween night, 2011, as MF Global filed for bankruptcy and $1.6 billion sat missing in the digital void, Jon Corzine was likely in his New York apartment, surrounded by lawyers and advisors, calculating his next move. He wasn't thinking about the farmer in Iowa whose wheat hedge had just become worthless. He wasn't thinking about the rancher in Montana facing foreclosure. He was thinking about himself, about survival, about limiting liability. That self-absorption, that ability to destroy lives while remaining focused on personal preservation, is perhaps the most essential quality for success in modern high finance. Empathy is a liability when you're playing with billions. Conscience is a weakness when the stakes are this high. Jon Corzine succeeded in many ways. He made hundreds of millions, reached the pinnacles of finance and politics, and walked away from the MF Global disaster without criminal charges. But he failed at the most human level. He hurt people who trusted him and felt nothing. Today, Jon Corzine lives in comfortable obscurity, wealthy enough to be insulated from consequence, prominent enough to occasionally appear at elite gatherings, but too toxic to ever regain real power. MF Global is a memory, a financial scandal buried beneath newer outrages and more recent disasters. The farmers who lost everything have either recovered or haven't, either rebuilt or moved on. The system continues unchanged, because changing it would require admitting that it's fundamentally broken, that customer protections are performative, that accountability for the powerful is optional. And that admission would shake the foundation of faith that keeps money flowing through the markets. So we pretend that segregated accounts are safe, that regulators are vigilant, that executives face consequences. We pretend because the alternative, accepting that we're all just one executive's bad bet away from ruin, is too frightening to contemplate. The $1.6 billion that vanished from MF Global wasn't really about money in the end. It was about something more fundamental, the belief that in America the rules apply equally, that theft is theft regardless of who commits it, that the powerful can't simply take what belongs to the powerless and walk away. MF Global proved that belief was always an illusion. The rules are different at the top. Theft is negotiable when it's called liquidity management, and the powerful can absolutely take what they want, as long as the complexity provides plausible deniability. Jon Corzine understood this truth instinctively. That's why he was never afraid, never panicked in a way that mattered. He knew the game was rigged in his favor from the start. And in the end, despite everything, he was right. The $1 billion vanished. The customers suffered. The firm collapsed. And Jon Corzine remained free. That's not just the story of MF Global. That's the story of American finance itself. A system where those who destroy the most face the least, where complexity protects the guilty, and where the only unforgivable crime is being powerless when disaster strikes. Subscribe and listen to our next story below.